Move it, nurse!
Sergeant First Class Derek Bulldog Kane shoved past Elena so hard she stumbled against the supply crates, her medical bag spilling bandages across the dusty ground. Real soldiers coming through, make way for the actual fighters. His crew of sycophants exploded in cruel laughter as Elena quietly began collecting her scattered supplies in the suffocating 112-degree heat of forward operating base Helmand. "Oh, look at that," Kane's voice dripped with fake sympathy as he pointed at the small black rose tattoo visible behind Elena's left ear, where her blonde hair had pulled loose from its bun. "She's got a little flower to match her delicate personality. How precious." He grabbed Elena's wrist as she reached for a roll of gauze, his grip unnecessarily tight. "Listen up, Tinkerbell. When the shooting starts, you better stay in your little medical tent playing doctor while the real warriors handle business. This Rose Garden Princess act might work back home, but out here," he leaned closer, his breath hot against her face. "Out here, weakness gets people killed." Elena met his glare with those unsettling blue eyes, calm as Arctic ice. "Medics don't fight," she replied quietly, not pulling away from his grip. But tonight, when insurgent forces would breach the perimeter and Kane would find himself pinned down by superior firepower, screaming for backup that wouldn't come, Elena would prove that sometimes the most lethal predator is the one everyone mistakes for prey, and that delicate rose behind her ear would be the last thing 27 enemy fighters would ever see. The dust cloud from Kane's departure settled like a shroud over the scattered medical supplies. Elena remained kneeling, her gray t-shirt already darkened with perspiration, methodically returning each item to its designated place in her bag. Her movements carried an almost ritualistic precision, trauma shears positioned at exact right angles, morphine ampules nested in foam cutouts designed for maximum protection, pressure bandages folded with military corners that would make a drill sergeant weep with pride. Every action is deliberate, efficient, economical. Corporal Mason Ridge, Kane's most devoted follower, lingered near the supply depot's entrance. "You hear that, boys? Florence Nightingale here thinks she's gonna heal the world with her little love taps." He kicked at a stray bandage that had escaped Elena's collection radius. "Tell me, Doc, what's your plan when the bad guys come calling? Gonna kiss their boo-boos and make it all better?" Elena's fingers never paused in their work, but those who looked closely might have noticed the way her thumb traced across the tactical pen clipped to her medical pack. A movement so subtle it could have been unconscious muscle memory, or perhaps something else entirely. "Ridge, back off." The voice belonged to Specialist Murphy, a communications technician whose Irish accent carried the weight of too many deployments and not enough sleep. "Some of us actually respect the medical corps around here." "Respect?" Ridge's laugh cracked like breaking glass. "For what? Passing out aspirin and playing nursemaid? Murphy, you've gone soft." Elena stood slowly, her medical bag secured and properly positioned on her shoulder. The rose tattoo caught a shaft of morning sunlight filtering through the depot's corrugated metal roof. Black petals with intricate shading that suggested far more artistic skill than a typical walk-in parlor could provide. The stem disappeared beneath her collar, its thorns rendered with anatomical precision that spoke of someone who understood both beauty and violence in equal measure. "Specialist Murphy," she said quietly, her voice carrying despite its low volume. "Thank you." Murphy nodded, his weathered face showing lines that came from squinting at radio frequencies in hostile territory for the better part of a decade. "Just common decency, Doc. Something some folks around here seem to have forgotten." Ridge spat in the dust near Elena's feet. "Common decency doesn't stop bullets, Murphy. When the mortars start falling, we'll see how much your precious medic's worth." The morning call to formation echoed across the base, its familiar cadence cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. Elena adjusted her pack and walked toward the medical tent, her stride neither hurried nor hesitant. Behind her, Murphy and Ridge continued their argument in increasingly colorful terms, but she had already dismissed their words from her consciousness. The medical tent stood at the base's geographic center, positioned for maximum accessibility from all sectors while remaining within the protective perimeter of the main defensive positions. Elena had studied the layout during her first week at Helmand, noting sight lines, blast shadows, and evacuation routes, with the thoroughness of someone who understood that medical personnel often became priority targets. Inside the tent, the temperature dropped a blessed 10 degrees, thanks to industrial cooling units that hummed with barely contained mechanical desperation. Elena began her morning equipment check, running through a mental checklist that encompassed everything from anesthetics to trauma surgery instruments. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who could perform these tasks blindfolded, which, given the frequency of night operations in hostile territory, wasn't entirely theoretical. Still playing house, I see. Kane's voice made several nearby medical technicians look up from their morning preparations. The sergeant stood in the tent's entrance, his massive frame blocking most of the available light. Behind him, the sun created a silhouette effect that made him appear even larger and more threatening than his natural 6 feet 4 inches suggested. "Sergeant Kane." Elena's acknowledgement carried no emotion, positive or negative. "Did you require medical assistance?" "Medical assistance?" Kane stepped into the tent, his combat boots heavy against the reinforced flooring. "From you? That's rich, Tinkerbell. I wouldn't trust you to put a bandage on a paper cut, much less handle anything that matters." Hospital Corpsman, 2nd Class Jackson, a Navy medic attached to their unit, glanced up from the ventilator he'd been calibrating. "Sergeant, with respect, Corporal Lawson has the highest patient survival rate in the battalion." Kane's laugh contained no humor whatsoever. "Survival rate? Jackson, you keep statistics on aspirin distribution now? How impressive." Elena continued her equipment check, but her movements had acquired a different quality, still precise, but with an underlying tension that suggested coiled springs waiting for release. The trauma shears in her hand caught the light, their titanium coating reflecting rainbow patterns across the tent's white interior walls. "I keep statistics on combat trauma interventions," Jackson replied, his voice carrying the steady professionalism that came from years of emergency medicine. "Gunshot wounds, blast injuries, hemorrhagic shock, real medical emergencies, Sergeant, and Corporal Lawson's numbers are consistently exceptional." Kane moved closer to Elena's workstation, deliberately invading her personal space. "Exceptional? You want to know what's exceptional, Jackson? Exceptional is putting rounds on target when your squad's taking fire. Exceptional is calling in accurate coordinates for close air support. Exceptional is leading from the front when everything goes to pieces." His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "Exceptional is not playing patty cake with wounded enemy combatants when you should be neutralizing threats." Elena's hands still out on the trauma kit she'd been organizing. For the first time since Kane had entered the tent, she looked directly at him. "Have you completed the required medical training update, Sergeant? The one scheduled for 0800 hours this morning?" Kane's expression darkened. "Are you seriously trying to tell me what training I need to complete, nurse?" "I'm asking whether you've completed mandatory training that directly relates to mission readiness and personnel safety," Elena replied, with the same calm tone she might use to request a patient's blood pressure reading. According to Section 4-7 of the current operational directive, all personnel assigned to forward operating positions must demonstrate current proficiency in basic field medicine. The tent had gone completely silent. Even the cooling units seemed to have reduced their mechanical complaints to a whisper. Jackson stared at Elena with something approaching amazement, not because of her knowledge of regulations, but because of her willingness to cite them directly to a sergeant who clearly outranked her and had already demonstrated his hostility. Kane's face flushed red beneath his tan. "You think you can hide behind regulations, Tinkerbell? You think paperwork makes you a soldier?" Elena returned to her equipment check. "I think training keeps people alive, Sergeant, and I think following proper procedures reduces casualties." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of a sealed surgical kit. "But then again, medics don't fight. We just save the people who do." If Kane's brutality just made your blood boil, smash that subscribe button, because this medic is about to serve justice colder than an Afghan winter. And if this story of hidden strength resonates with you, hit the thanks button to help us honor more silent warriors like Elena. We share military stories that expose the truth about unsung heroes every single week. Hit the bell so you never miss the moment when underestimation becomes a weapon. And hey, quick question. Where are you watching this incredible story from? Drop your country in the comments below. The rest of the morning passed with the peculiar tension that follows an unresolved confrontation. Kane had stormed out of the medical tent after delivering a final warning about knowing your place, but his presence seemed to linger like smoke from a badly ventilated fire. Elena continued her preparations with mechanical precision, though several of the other medical personnel had begun stealing glances at her with expressions that ranged from concern to curiosity. At exactly 10:30 a.m., the base's public address system crackled to life with an announcement that made everyone pause their activities. Medical personnel to the flight line, incoming casualties from Grid 77 Alpha, ETA 15 minutes. Elena's transformation was immediate and complete. The quiet, almost passive woman who had endured Kane's harassment disappeared, replaced by someone whose movements carried the authority of absolute expertise. She grabbed her trauma bag and headed for the landing zone at a pace that forced the other medical personnel to quicken their steps to keep up. The helicopter appeared as a black speck against the crystalline blue sky, growing larger as it approached with the distinctive sound signature of a UH-60 Blackhawk, operating at maximum sustainable speed. Elena positioned herself at the optimal distance from the landing zone, close enough for immediate access to casualties, far enough to avoid rotor wash that could compromise sterile procedures. The aircraft touched down with precision that spoke of pilots who understood that their cargo included human beings whose lives hung in the balance. Before the rotors had stopped spinning, the crew chief was already sliding the side door open and preparing to offload stretchers. "What have we got?" Elena called out, her voice carrying clearly over the mechanical noise. "Two urgent, one priority," the crew chief shouted back. "Improvised explosive device, burns and blast trauma." Elena moved forward without hesitation, her training taking over with the smoothness of a well-rehearsed dance. The first casualty was a young private whose left arm showed extensive burns from what appeared to be white phosphorus exposure. The second was a sergeant with multiple shrapnel wounds across his chest and abdomen. The third casualty was conscious but showed signs of traumatic brain injury from the blast's concussive force. "Jackson, take the TBI case to neurological observation," Elena directed, her hands already working on the sergeant's chest wounds, with movements that seemed to flow like water over stone. "Murphy, I need you to establish IV access on the burn victim. 2 large bore lines, Ringer's lactate, wide open." Murphy blinked in surprise. "Doc, I'm not medical personnel. I'm a radio operator." Elena's eyes met his for just a moment, and he saw something there that made him immediately understand why Jackson had mentioned her patient survival statistics. "Murphy, you served 2 tours in Iraq before transferring to communications. Your military occupational specialty was 68 whiskey, combat medic. You've got more field experience than half the personnel in this tent." Murphy stared at her for approximately 2 seconds before moving to comply with her instructions. Around them, the other medical personnel had fallen into supporting roles with the natural efficiency that comes from working with someone who clearly knows exactly what they're doing. Elena's hands moved across the sergeant's wounds with surgical precision, her trauma assessment proceeding in a sequence that suggested years of experience with blast injuries. She identified and addressed the most immediately life-threatening complications first: pneumothorax from a punctured lung, arterial bleeding from shrapnel that had severed a branch of the subclavian artery, potential internal bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention. "This needs to go to surgery right now," she announced, her voice carrying the absolute authority that comes from medical expertise. "Jackson, prep OR2 for emergency thoracotomy. Murphy, get Captain Harlow on the radio and inform him we have a Category 1 case requiring immediate evacuation to the Combat Support Hospital." Captain James Harlow arrived at the medical tent 18 minutes later, by which time Elena had stabilized all 3 casualties and coordinated their treatment with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. The burn victim was receiving appropriate fluid resuscitation and pain management. The traumatic brain injury case was stable and prepped for medical evacuation. The sergeant with the chest wounds was alive, conscious, and no longer in immediate danger of bleeding to death. Harlow, a career infantry officer with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for unflappable competence under pressure, surveyed the medical tent with the practiced eye of someone who understood both tactical situations and human nature. Elena stood near the central treatment area, her gray t-shirt now stained with blood and other medical fluids, her blonde hair still pulled back in that regulation bun that somehow never seemed to come completely undone. "Corporal Lawson," he said quietly. "Yes, sir. Outstanding work. All 3 casualties are stable and ready for evacuation." Elena nodded, her expression showing neither pride nor false modesty. "Thank you, sir. The sergeant will require surgical intervention at a higher-level facility, but his condition should remain stable during transport." Harlow made a mental note of her clinical assessment, which matched his own observations and the helicopter crew's medical evaluation. "Where did you complete your advanced trauma training, Corporal?" For just a moment, Elena hesitated, It was such a brief pause that most people would have missed it entirely, but Harlow had spent enough time evaluating personnel under stress to recognize the signs of someone carefully choosing their words. Fort Sam Houston, sir. Advanced individual training for combat medics. Harlow nodded, though something in Elena's response suggested there might be more to the story. Standard combat medic training, while comprehensive, didn't typically produce the level of clinical expertise he'd just witnessed. The surgical precision of her trauma assessment, the confident manner in which she directed other personnel, the instinctive understanding of triage priorities, these suggested additional training that went beyond basic military medical education. Carry on, Corporal. Excellent work. As Harlow left the medical tent, Elena began the process of restocking and sterilizing equipment with the same methodical precision she'd shown during the medical emergency. Her movements had returned to their earlier controlled efficiency, but those who looked closely might have noticed that her hands shook slightly as she sealed used instruments in sterile containers. Jackson approached her workstation with an expression of undisguised admiration. "Doc, that was incredible. I've never seen anyone handle multiple trauma cases with that kind of precision." Elena continued her post-incident procedures. "Training and preparation, nothing more." "Training and preparation don't account for what I just watched," Jackson replied. "You've got skills that go way beyond standard combat medic certification. Where did you really learn to work like that?" Elena's pause was longer this time, and when she looked at Jackson, her blue eyes carried something that might have been pain, or memory, or perhaps both. "Experience teaches things that training can't, Jackson. Sometimes you learn skills you never wanted to learn." Before Jackson could respond, the tent's entrance flaps parted to admit Lieutenant Ava Torres, a signals intelligence officer whose arrival immediately changed the atmosphere in the medical tent. Torres was Elena's height and build, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and brown eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. She wore the standard desert camouflage uniform, but her bearing suggested someone comfortable with authority despite her relatively junior rank. "Elena," Torres said quietly, and the use of Elena's first name indicated a level of familiarity that went beyond normal military protocol. "Ava." Elena's response carried warmth that had been absent from all her other interactions. "I didn't know you were at Helmand." Torres glanced around the medical tent, taking note of the other personnel within listening distance. "Just transferred in this morning. Thought I'd stop by and see how you were settling in." Elena sealed the last of the medical waste containers and turned to face her friend fully. "I'm managing. Same old challenges, same old solutions." Torres smiled, but her expression carried undercurrents that suggested their conversation involved layers of meaning that weren't immediately apparent. "You always were good at managing challenges, sometimes too good for your own safety." "Ava." I know. We'll talk later." Torres glanced around the tent again, her intelligence officer's training evident in the way she cataloged potential listening posts and security concerns. "Dinner at the command post tonight? 1800 hours?" Elena nodded. "I'll be there." After Torres left, Jackson approached Elena with barely contained curiosity. "Old friend?" Elena began organizing her trauma bag for the next potential emergency. "Something like that." The afternoon brought the kind of oppressive heat that made movement feel like swimming through liquid metal. Elena had positioned herself in the medical tent's most ventilated section, updating patient records and reviewing treatment protocols when Kane reappeared with his usual subtle grace. Well, if it isn't our little hero." Kane's voice carried a tone that transformed what should have been praise into something vaguely threatening. "Heard you played doctor with some real casualties today?" Elena continued typing medical reports on a ruggedized laptop computer. "I provided medical care to injured personnel, Sergeant. Standard operating procedure." Kane moved closer, his presence filling the tent's limited space like a toxic cloud. "Standard operating procedure? Jackson's been telling everyone you performed miracles in here. Says you handled those casualties like some kind of surgical specialist." "Hospital Corpsman Jackson has a tendency toward hyperbole," Elena replied without looking up from her computer screen. "The casualties received appropriate medical care according to established protocols." Appropriate medical care. Kane seemed to taste the words like something unpleasant. "Tell me something, Tinkerbell. Where exactly did a little nurse like you learn to handle combat trauma like a seasoned surgeon?" Elena's fingers stopped moving across the keyboard, though her eyes remained fixed on the screen. "Combat medic training covers trauma medicine, Sergeant. Emergency procedures, wound management, hemorrhage control, Kane leaned against her workstation, deliberately invading her personal space in a way that made several other medical personnel glance up from their own tasks. Combat medic training. Right. And I suppose they taught you how to coordinate multiple treatment teams and direct medical evacuation procedures too? Leadership development is part of advanced individual training, Elena said, her voice maintaining its characteristic calm despite Kane's increasingly aggressive posture. Medical personnel are expected to take charge during emergency situations. Kane's laugh was harsh and humorless. Leadership development. That's rich. You know what I think, nurse? I think there's more to your little story than you're letting on. Elena finally looked up from her computer, meeting Kane's stare with those unsettling blue eyes. Is there something specific you need, Sergeant? Medical assistance, equipment requisition, training verification? What I need, Kane said, leaning closer until his face was approximately 6 inches from hers, is to understand exactly what kind of game you think you are playing here. Elena's response was interrupted by the arrival of Corporal Mason Ridge, who burst into the medical tent with the enthusiasm of someone bringing news he considered significant. Sergeant Kane, you're not going to believe this. I just got off the radio with Supply Command, and guess what? Our little flower girl here has been asking for equipment that's way above her clearance level. Kane straightened, his attention immediately focused on Ridge with predatory intensity. What kind of equipment? Ridge produced a printed requisition form with the triumphant air of someone revealing a smoking gun. Advanced surgical instruments, microsurgery kits, anesthesia equipment rated for major surgical procedures. He looked directly at Elena. Now, why would a simple combat medic need gear like that? Elena returned to her computer screen. Forward operating bases maintain surgical capabilities for cases that can't be evacuated to higher-level facilities. Standard medical readiness requires appropriate equipment inventory. Standard medical readiness, Kane repeated slowly. Ridge, does this sound like standard medical readiness to you? Ridge shook his head with exaggerated disbelief. Sergeant, I've been deployed 6 times, and I've never seen a combat medic requesting microsurgery equipment. This is specialized gear that requires years of surgical training to use properly. Kane's smile was predatory and unpleasant. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. He leaned over Elena's workstation again. Tell me, Tinkerbell, you got surgical training I don't know about? Maybe some secret medical degree you forgot to mention? Elena saved her document and closed the laptop with deliberate precision. Sergeant, if you have concerns about medical equipment procurement, I suggest you discuss them with Captain Harlow or the medical officer in charge. Equipment requisitions follow established chain of command protocols. Kane straightened to his full height, his expression showing the satisfaction of someone who believes he's gained significant leverage. Oh, I'll definitely be discussing this with Captain Harlow. In fact, I think there are quite a few things about you that need discussing with command. Ridge nodded eagerly. Sergeant, you want me to check her service record, see what other interesting details might be hiding in there? Elena stood up from her workstation, shouldering her medical bag with the same methodical efficiency she brought to all her actions. Gentlemen, I have medical rounds to complete, if you'll excuse me. Kane moved to block her path to the tent's exit. Actually, nurse, I don't think you're excused at all. I think you and I need to have a more detailed conversation about exactly who you are and what you're doing at my base. Elena looked at Kane with those Arctic blue eyes, and for just a moment, something flickered behind them. Something that suggested depths and currents that ran far beneath the surface calm. Your base, Sergeant? That's right, Tinkerbell. My base, my area of responsibility, my personnel to protect. And I'm starting to think one of my personnel might not be exactly what she appears to be. Elena stepped closer to Kane, and despite the significant difference in their size, her presence seemed to fill more space than physics would suggest possible. Sergeant Kane, I am a United States Army combat medic, currently in all training requirements, properly assigned to this unit through normal personnel channels, and fully qualified to perform all duties related to my military occupational specialty. Her voice remained calm, but it had acquired an edge that cut through the tense oppressive heat like a blade through silk. If you have specific concerns about my performance or qualifications, I encourage you to address them through proper command channels. Kane blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the subtle shift in Elena's demeanor. For approximately 3 seconds, the dynamics in the tent had changed. Elena was no longer the quiet, passive target of his harassment, but something else entirely. Then the moment passed, and Elena walked around Kane toward the tense exit, as if he weren't there at all. "This isn't over, nurse," Kane called after her. "Not by a long shot." Elena paused at the tense entrance flap, turning back to look at Kane and Ridge with an expression that revealed nothing. "No, Sergeant, I don't imagine it is." The late afternoon heat had begun its gradual retreat when Elena made her way to the communications bunker for her scheduled meeting with Torres. The bunker was a reinforced concrete structure built partially underground, designed to withstand indirect fire while maintaining the sophisticated electronic equipment necessary for signals intelligence operations. Torres was waiting in a small room adjacent to the main communications center, a space that provided both privacy and protection from electronic surveillance. When Elena entered, Torres gestured for her to take a seat on one of the military standard folding chairs that constituted the room's only furniture. "How long have you been in Helmand?" Torres asked without preamble. 3 weeks, Elena replied. "Long enough to establish routines, not long enough to attract significant attention." Torres smiled grimly. "Elena, you're a combat medic with advanced surgical skills at a forward operating base where medical personnel are constantly under scrutiny. You've already attracted significant attention." Elena leaned back in her chair, her expression showing the first symbol of genuine exhaustion she'd displayed all day. "Kane suspects something. He's not smart enough to figure out what, but he's persistent enough to keep digging." "Kane's not the problem," Torres said quietly. "Kane's a sergeant with limited access to classified information and no connections to higher-level intelligence operations. The problem is what happens when Kane's digging attracts attention from people who do have access and connections." Elena's blue eyes focused on Torres with laser intensity. "Ava, what exactly are you doing in Helmand?" Torres reached into her cargo pocket and produced a photograph, not an official military photograph, but something more personal. The image showed Elena and Torres together, but they wore different uniforms and their appearance suggested the picture had been taken several years earlier. "I'm here because intelligence sources indicated that someone with your background and skill set had been assigned to this base under standard combat medic credentials," Torres said. "I'm here because the people who track such things wanted to confirm whether Elena Lawson, combat medic, was the same person as someone else they'd been looking for." Elena stared at the photograph for a long moment. "You can't hide forever, Raven." The words hung in the air between them, like smoke from an extinguished fire. Elena, Raven, reached for the photograph, her fingers tracing the edge of the image as if trying to understand how the past had managed to catch up with her. "How long have they known?" she asked. "Officially, they don't know anything. Unofficially," Torres paused, choosing her words carefully. "There are people who remember Operation Bloodline. People who remember what happened when an entire special operations unit was disbanded overnight with no official explanation." Raven placed the photograph on the small table between them. Operation Bloodline was classified above top secret. The personnel records were sealed and buried so deep they shouldn't exist anymore. "Officially, they don't exist," Torres agreed. "But unofficially, there are people who remember that Operation Bloodline produced some of the most effective special operations personnel in military history. And there are people who wonder what happened to those personnel after the unit was disbanded." The implications of Torres's words settled over the small room like a heavy blanket. Raven had spent 3 weeks building a carefully constructed identity as a quiet, competent combat medic whose only distinguishing characteristics were her unusual precision and her small black rose tattoo. Now, it appeared that her past was more visible than she'd realized. "What do they want, Ava?" Torres leaned forward, her expression showing the strain of carrying information she didn't want to deliver. "They want to know if Raven 17 is still operational. They want to know if her skills have deteriorated during her time away from special operations. And they want to know whether she's someone they can still count on if the situation requires her particular expertise." Raven's hand unconsciously moved to the rose tattoo behind her left ear, her fingers tracing the delicate petals that carried so much more meaning than their appearance suggested. "And if I tell them I just want to be a combat medic, if I tell them I'm done with special operations, then they'll probably respect that decision," Torres said. "Probably. But, Elena, there are situations developing in this theater that might require someone with your background. Situations where a standard combat medic wouldn't be sufficient." Before Raven could respond, the communications bunker's emergency alarm began blaring with the distinctive pattern that indicated incoming indirect fire. Both women immediately moved toward the bunker's reinforced exit, their training taking over with automatic precision. "This conversation isn't finished," Torres said as they reached the exit. Raven nodded grimly. "No, I don't think it is." The mortar rounds impacted approximately 400 meters from the communications bunker, close enough to feel the concussive waves, but far enough away to avoid immediate danger. Raven and Torres emerged from the bunker to find the base responding with practiced efficiency, personnel moving to defensive positions, return fire being coordinated by the Fire Direction Center, medical personnel preparing for potential casualties. Elena checked her medical bag and jogged toward the aid station, her movement patterns shifting back to those of a combat medic responding to a potential mass casualty situation. Behind her, Torres watched with the expression of someone who understood that they'd just witnessed a preview of much larger complications to come. The medical tent had transformed into a controlled chaos of preparation. Elena immediately fell into the familiar rhythm of emergency medical preparation, checking equipment, coordinating with other medical personnel, establishing communication with higher-level medical facilities in case evacuation became necessary. Kane appeared in the tent's entrance approximately 10 minutes after the mortar attack had ended, his expression showing a mixture of adrenaline and suspicion. "Well, well, look who's right back in her element." Elena continued organizing trauma supplies. "Sergeant Kane, did you sustain any injuries during the indirect fire attack?" Kane moved into the tent with his usual aggressive confidence. "No injuries, nurse. Just interesting observations about how certain people react when the shooting starts." Elena looked up from her equipment check. "I'm not sure I understand your meaning, Sergeant." Kane's smile was predatory. "Really? Because what I observed was a combat medic who moved toward potential danger with the kind of confidence that comes from significant combat experience. Not the kind of confidence you get from standard training, but the kind you get from real-world experience under fire." Elena returned to her equipment organization. "Combat medics train for emergency situations, Sergeant. Responding to indirect fire attacks is part of standard readiness protocols." "Standard readiness protocols," Kane repeated, with obvious skepticism. "Tell me something, Tinkerbell. How many combat deployments have you completed?" Elena's hand stilled on the trauma kit she'd been checking. "This is my first deployment to Afghanistan." Kane leaned against her workstation with the satisfaction of someone who believes he's identified a significant inconsistency. "First deployment to Afghanistan, but not your first combat deployment." Elena's response was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Harlow, who entered the medical tent with the expression of someone carrying information he considered important. "Corporal Lawson," Harlow said, "I need to speak with you privately." Kane straightened, clearly hoping to overhear whatever information Harlow wanted to discuss. "Captain, if this involves medical readiness or personnel security, I should—" "Sergeant Kane," Harlow interrupted with the quiet authority that comes from command experience. "This is a private conversation. Please continue with your other duties." Kane's expression showed frustration, but military protocol left him no choice but to comply. "Yes, sir. I'll be available if you need anything." After Kane left, Harlow turned his attention to Elena with the focused intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. "Corporal, I've been reviewing your service record." Elena maintained her characteristic calm, but those who knew her well might have noticed the subtle tension that appeared around her eyes. "Yes, sir. Your military occupational specialty is listed as 68 Whiskey Combat Medic. Your training records show completion of advanced individual training at Fort Sam Houston, followed by additional medical education at various facilities." Harlow paused, studying Elena's expression for any reaction. "However, some of the training facilities listed in your record are unusual for standard combat medic certification." Elena waited, neither confirming nor denying Harlow's observations. The Defense Medical Readiness Training Institute, the Special Operations Medical Training Center, the Joint Trauma Analysis and Prevention Program. Harlow named each facility with the precision of someone who understood their significance. These are not standard educational facilities for regular Army medical personnel. Elena's response was carefully measured. "Sir, I received additional medical training as part of my professional development. The Army encourages personnel to pursue advanced education opportunities." Harlow nodded slowly. "Yes, the Army does encourage professional development. However, The facilities I mentioned require special security clearances and specific command approval for attendance. They're not open to standard personnel. The implications of Harlow's words hung in the air between them, like a challenge waiting to be acknowledged. Elena understood that her carefully constructed cover identity was beginning to show cracks, and that those cracks were being noticed by people with the authority and resources to investigate further. "Captain," she said quietly, "is there a specific concern about my qualifications or performance?" Harlow studied her for a long moment before responding. "Corporal, your performance has been exemplary. Your medical skills are far above average, and your response to emergency situations shows a level of competence that frankly exceeds what I would expect from someone with your stated background." Elena remained silent, waiting for Harlow to continue. "However," Harlow said, "there are certain inconsistencies in your record that raise questions. And in a combat environment, questions about personnel backgrounds can become security concerns." Elena understood the direction of Harlow's conversation, and she realized that her time as a simple combat medic at Forward Operating Base Helmand was approaching its end. The careful balance she'd maintained for 3 weeks was beginning to collapse under the weight of too much scrutiny and too many unanswered questions. "Sir," she said finally, "what would you like me to do?" Harlow's expression showed the conflict of a commander who understood that he was dealing with information beyond his clearance level. "For now, continue with your regular duties, but, Corporal, I suspect this conversation will continue at a higher level of command." As Harlow left the medical tent, Elena understood that the quiet anonymity she'd sought at Helmand was no longer possible. The questions about her background would only intensify, and eventually, someone with the appropriate clearance and authority would demand answers she wasn't sure she was prepared to give. Elena reached into her personal gear and retrieved a small, weathered photograph that she kept hidden beneath other papers. The image showed a group of soldiers in specialized uniforms, their faces partially obscured by tactical equipment, standing in front of a helicopter that bore no standard military markings. In the bottom corner of the photograph, barely visible, were the words "Operation Bloodline" written in faded ink. Elena looked at the photograph for a long moment, her fingers tracing the faces of people who no longer existed in any official capacity. Then she returned the image to its hiding place and began preparing for whatever complications the next day would bring. The evening meal at the base dining facility proceeded with the usual mixture of exhaustion, camaraderie, and tension that characterized military life in a combat zone. Elena sat with Torres at a table near the facility's perimeter, their conversation carefully neutral despite the significant information they'd exchanged earlier. Kane occupied a table approximately 20 feet away, surrounded by his usual collection of followers and admirers. His voice carried clearly across the dining facility as he regaled his audience with increasingly elaborate theories about Elena's background and qualifications. "I'm telling you, something's not right about that woman," Kane said loudly enough to ensure Elena could hear every word. "Combat medics don't handle trauma cases like trained surgeons. They don't request specialized equipment above their clearance level. And they definitely don't move under fire like someone with advanced combat experience." Torres glanced toward Kane's table with the expression of someone evaluating a potential threat. "He's not going to let this go," she said quietly. Elena continued eating her regulation meal with mechanical precision. "No, he's not." Torres leaned closer, lowering her voice to ensure their conversation remained private. "Elena, you need to understand that Kane's investigation is going to attract attention from people who have access to classified databases. If they run a deep background check, they'll find inconsistencies," Elena finished. "Gaps in my service record that don't align with standard career progression, training that exceeds my stated qualifications, references to units and operations that don't appear in regular personnel files." Torres nodded grimly. "And once they start finding inconsistencies, they'll keep digging until they find the truth." Elena set down her fork and looked directly at Torres. "Ava, how long do you think I have before this becomes a crisis?" Torres considered the question carefully. Given Kane's persistence and the attention your medical performance has already attracted, maybe 48 hours before someone with real authority starts asking questions you can't answer without revealing classified information. Elena absorbed this assessment with the same calm she'd shown throughout their conversation. "Then I need to make some decisions." Torres reached across the table and placed her hand over Elena's. "Whatever you decide, you don't have to face it alone." Elena squeezed Torres's hand gratefully, but her expression showed the weight of carrying secrets that went far beyond normal military classification levels. Some choices can only be made by the person who has to live with the consequences. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Hospital Corpsman Jackson, who carried his meal tray and wore the expression of someone seeking permission to join their table. "Mind if I sit?" Jackson asked. "Kane's table is getting a little too loud for my taste." Elena gestured to an empty chair. "Please." Jackson settled into his seat and immediately lowered his voice to match their conversational tone. "Doc, I don't know what Kane's problem is, but his theories about your background are getting more elaborate by the day." Elena continued eating without apparent concern. "People see what they want to see, Jackson. Kane sees mysteries where there might just be competence." Jackson shook his head. "Doc, with all due respect, what I saw today went way beyond competence. I've worked with combat medics from 3 different branches of service, and I've never seen anyone handle multiple trauma cases with your level of precision and authority." Torres watched Elena carefully, understanding that Jackson's observations represented exactly the kind of attention that could lead to broader investigation. Elena met Jackson's gaze directly. "Jackson, emergency medicine requires quick decision-making and efficient coordination. Training and experience develop those skills over time." Jackson leaned forward, his expression showing genuine concern rather than idle curiosity. "Doc, I'm not trying to cause problems for you, but Kane's not the only one who's noticed that your skills seem to exceed your stated background. Other people are starting to ask questions." Elena set down her fork and gave Jackson her complete attention. "What kind of questions?" Jackson glanced around the dining facility to ensure their conversation remained private. "Questions about where you trained, questions about your previous assignments, questions about how a first deployment combat medic acquired advanced surgical skills." Torres and Elena exchanged a look that conveyed volumes of unspoken communication. Elena turned back to Jackson. "And what do you tell people when they ask these questions?" Jackson's response showed the loyalty that often develops between medical personnel who trust each other's competence. "I tell them that your performance speaks for itself, and that speculation about personnel backgrounds is none of their business." Elena smiled, the first genuine smile she'd shown all day. "Thank you, Jackson. That means more than you know." Jackson nodded, but his expression remained serious. "Doc, I don't know what your story is, and honestly, I don't need to know. But I can tell you that Kane's not going to stop digging, and eventually his digging is going to reach people who have the authority to demand answers." Elena understood the warning implicit in Jackson's words. Her time at Forward Operating Base Helmand was running out, and she would soon need to make choices about how much of her real identity she was willing to reveal. The rest of the evening passed quietly, with Elena returning to her quarters and attempting to process the day's events. Her personal space was Spartan, even by military standards. A narrow cot, a small storage locker, and minimal personal belongings that revealed nothing about her background or history. Elena sat on her cot and removed the hidden photograph from her personal gear, studying the faces of people who had once been as close as family. Operation Bloodline had been more than a military unit. It had been a brotherhood of highly trained specialists who trusted each other with their lives on a regular basis. Now, all those people were gone, officially erased from military records as if they had never existed. Elena was the only surviving member of a unit that had completed missions so classified that even acknowledging their existence would compromise national security. Elena placed the photograph on her small table and began composing a letter that she hoped she would never need to send. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, but its contents would make clear that Elena Raven Lawson understood the complications that were developing around her cover identity. As she wrote, Elena could hear the sounds of the base settling into its nighttime routine, guards changing shifts, equipment being secured, personnel preparing for sleep in a hostile environment where tomorrow might bring challenges that would test everyone's training and resolve. Elena finished her letter and sealed it in an envelope that she placed in her personal effects. Then she lay down on her cot and stared at the ceiling, wondering how long she could maintain her carefully constructed identity as a simple combat medic. Outside her quarters, the Afghan night was filled with the usual sounds of a forward operating base. Generators humming, radio chatter from the command post, the distant sound of aircraft providing security overwatch. But Elena's trained ears detected something else. footsteps moving past her quarters with the deliberate pattern of someone conducting surveillance. Elena remained motionless on her cot, but her senses were fully alert. Someone was taking a very close interest in her activities, and that interest was likely to intensify as Kane's investigation continued to raise questions about her background. Elena closed her eyes and began the mental preparation that had once been second nature during her time with Operation Bloodline. If her cover identity was about to be compromised, she needed to be ready for whatever consequences might follow. The next morning brought news that would accelerate Elena's timeline in ways she hadn't anticipated. Torres appeared at the medical tent during Elena's routine equipment check, carrying orders that bore the seal of battalion headquarters. "Elena," Torres said quietly, handing her the official documents, "you've been ordered to report to battalion intelligence for a security interview." Elena read the orders carefully, noting that the interview was scheduled for 1400 hours, approximately 6 hours away. The orders were signed by Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, the battalion's intelligence officer, and carried the classification markings that indicated they involved sensitive information. Elena folded the orders and placed them in her cargo pocket. "Ava, what can you tell me about Lieutenant Colonel Morrison?" Torres glanced around the medical tent to ensure they weren't being overheard. Morrison's career intelligence, 3 deployments, extensive experience with personnel security investigations. He's thorough, professional, and has access to classification levels that go well beyond standard battalion requirements. Elena understood the implications immediately. Morrison would have access to databases and information sources that could reveal inconsistencies in her cover identity. If he conducted a thorough investigation, he would eventually discover the gaps and anomalies that pointed toward her real background. "Elena," Torres said quietly, "Morrison's interview isn't routine. Someone with significant authority has requested a detailed security review of your background and qualifications." Elena absorbed this information with characteristic calm, though her mind was already beginning to develop contingency plans. "How much do you think he knows?" Torres considered the question carefully. "Officially? Probably just the surface inconsistencies that Kane and others have identified. Unofficially?" She paused. "Morrison has connections to people who track former special operations personnel. He might know more than he's authorized to reveal." Elena removed her medical bag and began organizing its contents with the methodical precision that had become her signature. "Ava, if Morrison's investigation reveals my real background, what kind of consequences are we looking at?" Torres's expression showed the strain of carrying information she wished she didn't possess. "Best case scenario, you get reassigned to a position that makes better use of your actual qualifications. Worst case scenario?" She hesitated. "Worst case, you get recalled to active special operations status, whether you want it or not." Elena's hands stilled on the trauma kit she'd been organizing. Recall to active status. For what purpose? Torres leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Elena, there are developing situations in this theater that require people with your specific skill set. Situations that can't be handled by standard personnel." Before Elena could respond, Kane appeared in the medical tent's entrance, with his usual lack of subtlety. Well, if it isn't our mysterious little medic." His voice carried satisfaction that suggested he'd heard about Elena's scheduled interview. "Heard you've got a meeting with battalion intelligence today." Elena continued organizing her medical equipment. "Sergeant Kane, did you require medical assistance?" Kane moved into the tent with predatory confidence. "Medical assistance? No, Tinkerbell. But I am curious about what kind of questions Lieutenant Colonel Morrison might ask during a security interview." Elena looked up from her equipment. "I wouldn't presume to speculate about official military procedures, Sergeant." Kane's laugh was harsh and unpleasant. "Official military procedures? Right. Well, I hope you were prepared to answer some very detailed questions about your background and qualifications." Torres stood up from her position near Elena's workstation, her movement carrying the subtle authority of someone accustomed to dealing with hostile personalities. "Sergeant Kane, Corporal Lawson has duties to complete before her scheduled appointment. Perhaps you could continue this conversation at a more appropriate time." Kane's attention shifted to Torres with obvious skepticism. "And you are?" Torres' response was precise and professional. "Lieutenant Torres, Battalion Signals Intelligence. I'm here on official business." Kane studied Torres for a moment, clearly trying to determine whether she represented a threat to his investigation. "Official business. How convenient." Elena sealed her medical bag and shouldered it with efficient movements. Sergeant Kane, Lieutenant Torres, I have medical rounds to complete before my 1400 hours appointment. If you'll excuse me. Kane moved to block Elena's path to the tent's exit. Actually, nurse, I think we should discuss what you plan to tell Lieutenant Colonel Morrison about your background and qualifications. Elena met Kane's gaze with those unsettling blue eyes, and for just a moment, something flickered behind them that made Kane unconsciously step backward. Sergeant, I plan to answer Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's questions honestly and completely, in accordance with military regulations and security protocols. Kane blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the subtle shift in Elena's presence. Honestly and completely. That should be interesting. Elena stepped around Kane and walked toward the tent's exit. Yes, Sergeant, I imagine it will be. Elena spent the morning completing her medical rounds with the same methodical precision she brought to all her duties, but her mind was processing the implications of the upcoming security interview. Morrison's investigation would inevitably uncover information that pointed toward her real background, and she would need to decide how much truth she was prepared to reveal. At 13:30 hours, Elena reported to the battalion headquarters building, a reinforced concrete structure that housed the command and control facilities for the entire forward operating base. The building's interior was kept at a comfortable temperature by industrial air conditioning units, providing relief from the oppressive heat that dominated most of the base. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's office was located on the building's second floor, behind a door that bore his name and rank in regulation lettering. Elena knocked and was instructed to enter by a voice that carried the authority of long military experience. Morrison was a lean man in his early 40s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that suggested someone accustomed to analyzing complex information. His desk was organized with military precision, and the walls of his office displayed certificates and commendations that indicated a distinguished career in military intelligence. Corporal Lawson, Morrison said, gesturing for her to take a seat in one of the chairs positioned in front of his desk. Thank you for coming. Elena sat with perfect military posture, her medical bag positioned at her feet, and her expression showing polite attention. Yes, sir. Morrison opened a thick folder that Elena recognized as a personnel file, presumably her own. Corporal, I've asked you here to discuss some questions that have arisen regarding your background and qualifications. Elena waited silently for Morrison to continue. Morrison removed several documents from the folder and arranged them on his desk, where Elena could see them. Your current military occupational specialty is listed as 68 Whiskey Combat Medic. Your training records show completion of advanced individual training at Fort Sam Houston, followed by additional medical education at several specialized facilities. Elena recognized some of the documents as standard personnel records, but others appeared to be intelligence assessments that went beyond normal administrative paperwork. Morrison continued, however, there are certain aspects of your record that raise questions. Your medical performance at this base has been consistently exceptional, suggesting skills and experience that exceed standard combat medic training. Elena maintained her calm expression. Sir, I take my medical responsibilities seriously and try to maintain high standards of patient care. Morrison nodded slowly. Yes, your dedication is evident. However, several incidents have brought your background to the attention of command personnel. Your handling of multiple trauma cases, your familiarity with advanced medical procedures, your requests for specialized equipment, these suggest medical training that goes beyond standard Army education. Elena understood that Morrison was building toward more specific questions about her background, and she realized that her responses would determine whether her cover identity could be maintained. Morrison picked up another document from the folder. Corporal, I've reviewed your training records in detail, and I've discovered that some of the facilities listed in your educational background require special security clearances for attendance. Elena's expression remained neutral. Sir, I received additional medical training as part of my professional development. The specific details of that training would be classified according to the security protocols of the institutions involved. Morrison's eyes sharpened with interest. Classified according to security protocols. That's an interesting way to phrase it, Corporal. Elena realized that Morrison had identified the verbal pattern that suggested familiarity with classified operations and security procedures. Her response had revealed more about her background than she'd intended. Morrison leaned forward slightly. Corporal, let me ask you a direct question. Have you ever been assigned to classified military units or operations that don't appear in your standard personnel record? Elena met Morrison's gaze directly, understanding that her answer would determine the direction of the remainder of the interview. She could continue to maintain her cover identity and hope that Morrison lacked access to the classified databases that contained information about Operation Bloodline, or she could acknowledge enough of the truth to satisfy his investigation while protecting the most sensitive details. Elena took a deep breath and made her choice. "Sir," she said quietly, "there are aspects of my military service that are classified beyond the level of a standard personnel security investigation." Morrison's expression showed satisfaction mixed with concern. "Corporal, I have top secret clearance and access to special access programs. What level of classification are we discussing?" Elena understood that Morrison was testing the depth of her knowledge about security classification systems. Her response would indicate whether she was someone who had worked with information classified at the highest levels of government. "Sir," Elena said carefully, "the operations I'm referring to were classified under special access programs with compartmented security protocols. Access was limited to personnel with specific need-to-know authorization." Morrison placed his hands on his desk and studied Elena with the focused attention of someone who had just confirmed his suspicions. "Corporal, special access programs with compartmented security protocols are reserved for the most sensitive military operations. Personnel assigned to such programs receive training and experience that goes far beyond standard military education." Elena waited for Morrison to continue, understanding that they had crossed a threshold in their conversation that couldn't be reversed. Morrison opened another section of her file and removed a document that Elena immediately recognized as a security clearance investigation report. "Corporal, I've been authorized to inform you that certain individuals with knowledge of classified operations have identified you as someone who may have been assigned to units that no longer exist in official records." Elena felt the careful structure of her cover identity collapsing around her like a building losing its foundation. Morrison clearly had access to information sources that connected her current identity to her previous service with Operation Bloodline. Morrison continued, "These individuals have suggested that your medical skills and tactical experience derive from service with specialized units that conducted operations so sensitive they were removed from official military records." Elena realized that her time as a simple combat medic at Forward Operating Base Helmand was officially over. Morrison's investigation had uncovered enough information to identify her real background, and continuing to maintain her cover identity would be both pointless and potentially harmful to military interests. Elena looked directly at Morrison and made the decision that would change everything about her situation at Helmand. "Sir," she said quietly, "I believe this conversation requires a higher level of security classification than a standard personnel interview." Morrison nodded slowly, his expression showing both relief and apprehension. "Corporal, I'm going to ask you to wait here while I make some phone calls to people who have the appropriate authority to continue this discussion." As Morrison left his office to make those phone calls, Elena understood that the quiet anonymity she had sought at Forward Operating Base Helmand was about to be replaced by complications she had hoped to avoid forever. Elena sat alone in Morrison's office, surrounded by documents that revealed the systematic unraveling of her carefully constructed cover identity. Through the office's single window, she could see the routine activities of a forward operating base: personnel moving between buildings, vehicles arriving with supplies, helicopters providing security overwatch. Elena reached unconsciously for the small black rose tattoo behind her left ear, her fingers tracing the delicate petals that served as the only visible reminder of who she had been before becoming a combat medic. The rose was more than a decoration. It was a symbol that connected her to people and events that officially no longer existed. Elena understood that within the next few hours, she would be forced to confront a past she had spent 3 years trying to leave behind. The choices she made during those conversations would determine not only her own future, but potentially the lives of other people who depended on maintaining the secrecy that surrounded Operation Bloodline. Elena closed her eyes and began the mental preparation that had once been second nature during her previous life. If her real identity was about to be revealed, she needed to be ready for whatever responsibilities and dangers that revelation might bring. Elena checked her tactical medical scanner. Military-grade diagnostic equipment, special operations medics rely on in combat zones. Advanced biometric monitoring enables instant trauma assessment under fire. 94% accuracy rate in identifying internal injuries invisible to standard examination. In life or death situations, this precision technology means the difference between saving a teammate and losing them forever. Morrison returned to his office 30 minutes later, accompanied by a man Elena didn't recognize, a tall, lean individual in civilian clothes whose bearing suggested military background despite his non-uniform appearance. Morrison gestured for Elena to remain seated, while he and the civilian took positions behind his desk. "Corporal Lawson," Morrison said formally, "this is Agent Reynolds from the Defense Intelligence Agency. Agent Reynolds has been authorized to discuss matters that are classified beyond the level of normal personnel security investigations." Reynolds studied Elena with the focused attention of someone trained to extract information from people who had been trained to resist interrogation. "Corporal, or perhaps I should use a different name." Elena met Reynolds' gaze directly. "Agent Reynolds, Elena Lawson is my legal name." Reynolds nodded slowly. "Yes, Elena Lawson is your legal name, but during your service with certain specialized units, you operated under different designations." Elena understood that Reynolds was testing her willingness to acknowledge her previous identity. "Agent Reynolds, if you're referring to classified operations, I would need to understand the scope and authority of this investigation before discussing operational details." Reynolds smiled grimly. "The scope of this investigation, Corporal, extends to the highest levels of military and intelligence command. The authority includes access to information classified under the most restrictive security protocols." Elena absorbed this information, understanding that Reynolds represented people who had the power to compel her cooperation regardless of her personal preferences. Reynolds continued, "Corporal, we're going to discuss Operation Bloodline." Elena's expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes shifted, a subtle change that suggested Reynolds had finally reached the core of whatever secrets she had been protecting. Reynolds opened a briefcase and removed a series of photographs that he placed on Morrison's desk where Elena could see them. The images showed military personnel and specialized equipment, conducting operations in environments that suggested extreme danger and complexity. Operation Bloodline, Reynolds said quietly, was a special access program that trained and deployed highly specialized operatives for missions that couldn't be accomplished by conventional military units. Elena studied the photographs, recognizing faces and locations that connected to memories she had tried to leave behind. Reynolds pointed to one of the photographs. "This image shows Operation Bloodline personnel conducting a classified mission in eastern Afghanistan approximately 4 years ago. The operation was successful, but it resulted in casualties that led to the unit's disbandment." Elena's attention focused on the photograph with laser intensity, her training allowing her to identify tactical details and operational parameters that revealed the complexity and danger of the mission depicted. Reynolds continued, "After Operation Bloodline was disbanded, its personnel were reassigned to conventional military units under new identities designed to protect the classified nature of their previous service." Elena understood that Reynolds was describing the process that had led to her current assignment as a combat medic at Forward Operating Base Helmand. Reynolds picked up another photograph. "This image shows Raven 17, one of Operation Bloodline's most effective operatives. Raven 17 specialized in medical operations in hostile environments, combining advanced trauma medicine with tactical skills that allowed her to function independently in situations that would overwhelm conventional personnel." Elena looked at the photograph, which showed herself in tactical gear approximately 4 years earlier. The image captured her during what appeared to be a medical evacuation operation, her hands working on a casualty while wearing equipment that clearly exceeded standard combat medic issue. Reynolds placed the photograph directly in front of Elena. "Corporal Lawson, you are Raven 17. Elena looked at the photograph for a long moment, then raised her eyes to meet Reynolds' gaze. "Agent Reynolds, if you already know who I am, what is the purpose of this investigation?" Reynolds' expression showed satisfaction, mixed with something that might have been relief. "The purpose, Raven 17, is to determine whether you are ready to return to active special operations status." Elena felt the weight of Reynolds' words settle over her like a heavy blanket. Her time as a simple combat medic was officially over, and her future would be determined by people who understood her real capabilities and had missions that required those capabilities. Elena straightened in her chair, her posture shifting subtly to reflect the confidence and authority that had once been second nature during her service with Operation Bloodline. "Agent Reynolds," she said quietly, "what kind of mission requires the reactivation of Raven 17?" Reynolds smiled, but his expression carried no warmth. The kind of mission, Raven, that only someone with your specific combination of medical expertise and tactical skills can accomplish. As Reynolds began to describe the details of what would become Elena's return to the world of classified operations and extraordinary danger, the small black rose tattoo behind her left ear seemed to catch the office's fluorescent lighting, its delicate petals and thorns serving as a reminder that some flowers bloom in the darkest places, and some people are most dangerous when they appear most vulnerable. The afternoon shadows lengthened across forward operating base Helmand as Elena's carefully constructed identity as a quiet combat medic dissolved into memory, replaced by the recognition that Raven 17 had always been present beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when her unique skills would be needed once again. Reynolds closed his briefcase with the methodical precision of someone who had delivered similar revelations countless times before. Raven 17, your reactivation status will be determined within the next 72 hours. Until then, you'll continue your duties as Corporal Lawson while we prepare for what comes next. Elena understood that her carefully constructed anonymity was dissolving by the hour, but she also recognized that direct confrontation with her past was now inevitable. Agent Reynolds, what about my current unit? My cover identity has been compromised. Morrison leaned forward. Corporal, your medical skills haven't been compromised. They have been revealed as exceptional. Continue your duties. We'll handle the administrative complications. Elena returned to the medical tent as the afternoon heat reached its crushing peak, her mind processing the reality that her quiet existence at forward operating base Helmand would soon end. The tent's familiar environment felt different now, less like sanctuary, more like a temporary position she was already beginning to leave behind. Jackson was calibrating equipment when she entered, his expression showing the concern of someone who had noticed the extended duration of her meeting with battalion intelligence. Doc, everything okay? You were gone for nearly 3 hours. Elena began organizing her medical supplies with the same methodical precision she'd maintained throughout her cover identity. Administrative review, Jackson, standard procedure for personnel with specialized training. Jackson studied her expression with the sharp attention of someone trained to recognize changes in people under stress. Doc, specialized training reviews don't usually last 3 hours or involve Defense Intelligence Agency personnel. Elena's hands stilled on the trauma kit she'd been organizing. Jackson's observational skills were sharper than she'd realized, and his comment revealed that her meeting hadn't been as discreet as Morrison had intended. Jackson, how did you know Agent Reynolds was DIA? Jackson's response carried the confidence of someone who had served long enough to recognize different categories of military and intelligence personnel. Doc, I've been deployed 6 times. You learn to identify people by their bearing, their equipment, their security protocols. Reynolds wasn't regular military intelligence. He was something more specialized. Elena understood that Jackson's experience made him a potential security concern, but his loyalty to medical personnel and his discretion during previous conversations suggested he could be trusted with limited information. Jackson, Elena said quietly, there are aspects of my background that are classified beyond normal personnel records. Today's meeting involved clarifying some of those aspects. Jackson nodded slowly. Doc, I figured there was more to your story than standard combat medic training. Your skills, your precision, your ability to coordinate complex medical situations. These suggested experience that goes beyond regular education. Elena felt a mixture of relief and apprehension that Jackson had identified her capabilities without requiring detailed explanations. His acceptance of her situation without demanding specifics demonstrated the kind of professional respect that made military medicine function effectively. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Torres, who entered the medical tent with information that immediately changed the atmosphere. Elena, Torres said, her voice carrying urgency despite its controlled tone, we need to discuss operational developments. Jackson glanced between Elena and Torres, recognizing the transition from casual conversation to something more serious. I'll be outside if you need me, Doc. After Jackson left, Torres moved closer to Elena's workstation and lowered her voice to ensure their conversation remained private. Elena, intelligence sources have identified increased enemy activity in this sector. There are indications that hostile forces are planning operations that specifically target medical facilities. Elena absorbed this information with the analytical mindset that had served her during countless tactical briefings. Ava, are you suggesting that enemy forces have identified this base's medical capabilities as a priority target? Torres nodded grimly. Elena, your medical performance has attracted attention not just from friendly forces, but potentially from hostile intelligence networks. Outstanding medical capabilities at forward operating bases represent strategic assets that enemy forces often try to eliminate. Elena understood the implications immediately. Her exceptional performance as a combat medic had made her valuable to friendly forces, but it had also potentially made her a target for enemy operations designed to degrade American medical capabilities. Ava, what kind of timeline are we looking at? Torres consulted notes written on what appeared to be standard military paper, but contained information that suggested access to classified intelligence sources. Elena, signals intelligence indicates potential hostile action within the next 24 to 48 hours. The timing coincides with your security review, which suggests that your reactivation might be connected to anticipated operational requirements. Elena realized that her meeting with Reynolds might have been more than a simple background investigation. It might have been preparation for missions that intelligence sources knew would soon become necessary. Ava, do you think my reactivation was planned before Kane's investigation brought attention to my background? Torres's expression showed the conflict of someone carrying information she wasn't certain she should reveal. Elena, I think Kane's investigation provided an excuse for a security review that higher command levels were already planning to conduct. Elena understood that her careful anonymity might have been an illusion from the beginning, that people with appropriate clearance levels had always known her real identity and had been waiting for the right circumstances to reveal it. Your curiosity about Elena's hidden past is about to pay off in the biggest way possible. Subscribe right now because the truth behind that rose tattoo will blow your mind. We bring verified military stories that challenge everything you think you know. The bell ensures you catch every shocking reveal. The evening brought a subtle change in the base's routine that Elena's trained senses immediately recognized. Personnel movements had acquired a different pattern, more purposeful, more coordinated, suggesting preparation for potential contact with hostile forces. Elena moved through her medical rounds with heightened awareness, noting the placement of defensive positions and the readiness levels of various units. At 1900 hours, Elena was completing equipment inventory when Kane appeared in the medical tent with an expression that showed satisfaction mixed with anticipation. Well, well, Tinkerbell, heard you had an interesting conversation with intelligence today. Elena continued her inventory procedures. Sergeant Kane, administrative review completed successfully. Kane moved closer to her workstation, his presence carrying the aggressive confidence of someone who believed he held significant leverage. Administrative review? That's what you're calling a 3-hour meeting with Defense Intelligence Agency personnel? Elena looked up from her equipment checklist. Sergeant, personnel security reviews are classified matters that aren't appropriate for general discussion. Kane's laugh was harsh and unpleasant. Classified matters, how convenient. Tell me something, nurse. Did your classified matters involve explaining how a simple combat medic acquired surgical skills that exceed most doctors? Elena understood that Kane's investigation had reached the point where he was making direct accusations about her background, which meant that maintaining her cover identity was no longer possible. Sergeant Kane, Elena said quietly, my medical qualifications have been reviewed by appropriate command authorities. If you have specific concerns about medical readiness or patient care, I encourage you to address them through proper channels. Kane leaned against her workstation with predatory satisfaction. Proper channels? You mean the same proper channels that just spent 3 hours investigating your background because people started asking questions about who you really are? Elena realized that Kane had either been briefed about her security review or had sources within the command structure that provided him with information about personnel investigations. Sergeant, what exactly do you want to know? Kane's expression showed triumph, as if Elena's question represented a significant victory in their ongoing conflict. What I want to know, Tinkerbell, is why someone with your apparent qualifications is pretending to be a simple combat medic at a forward operating base. Elena stood up from her workstation, and despite Kane's significant size advantage, her presence seemed to fill more space than physics would suggest possible. Sergeant Kane, some people serve where they're needed, not where their qualifications might suggest they belong. Kane blinked, temporarily thrown off balance by Elena's response and the subtle shift in her demeanor. For approximately 3 seconds, their dynamic had changed. Elena was no longer the quiet target of his harassment, but something else entirely. Before Kane could respond, the base's alarm system began sounding, with a distinctive pattern that indicated incoming indirect fire. Both Elena and Kane immediately moved toward defensive positions, their personal conflict temporarily superseded by tactical requirements. The mortar rounds impacted closer to the medical facility than previous attacks, close enough that the concussive waves shattered equipment and sent personnel diving for cover. Elena's trained instincts took over immediately. She grabbed her trauma bag and moved toward potential casualty collection points, her movements showing the confidence and precision of someone who had operated under fire before. Kane, taking cover behind a concrete barrier, watched Elena's response with expressions that revealed his growing understanding that he had fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. The attack lasted approximately 15 minutes, during which Elena provided medical care to 3 personnel who sustained minor injuries from flying debris. Her performance under fire was calm, efficient, and professional, exactly what would be expected from an experienced combat medic, but with subtle elements that suggested training and experience beyond standard qualification levels. The deployment paperwork beside Elena's dog tags, comprehensive coverage every soldier maximizes before high-risk missions, triple death benefits for families, disability protection, and deployment bonuses. 89% of special operations personnel increase coverage before classified assignments. Protecting the future matters as much as surviving today's mission when every operation could be your last. After the attack ended, Elena was treating the last casualty when Torres approached with information that would change everything about the base's security situation. "Elena," Torres said quietly, ensuring their conversation couldn't be overheard by other personnel. "Intelligence intercepts indicate that tonight's attack was reconnaissance for a larger operation planned for tomorrow night." Elena finished applying a pressure bandage to a soldier's arm laceration before responding. "Ava, what kind of larger operation?" Torres glanced around the medical tent to ensure they weren't being monitored. "Ground assault. Approximately 50 to 70 hostile personnel, with the primary objective of destroying medical facilities and eliminating key personnel." Elena absorbed this information with the analytical mindset that had served her during countless tactical briefings. "Ava, are you suggesting that enemy forces have specifically targeted this base's medical capabilities?" Torres nodded grimly. "Elena, outstanding medical performance creates strategic value that hostile forces often prioritize for elimination. Your skills have made this facility a target." Elena understood the implications immediately. Her exceptional performance as a combat medic had created value for friendly forces, but it had also made her and her facility priority targets for enemy operations. "Ava, what's the defensive plan?" Torres's expression showed the conflict of someone carrying information she wasn't authorized to share. "Elena, the defensive plan assumes that medical personnel will remain in protected areas while security forces handle combat operations." Elena recognized the limitation of conventional defensive planning when applied to situations involving her actual capabilities. "Ava, that assumption might not be appropriate for all medical personnel." Torres met Elena's gaze directly. "Elena, I think tomorrow night you are going to have to make some decisions about how much of your real identity you're willing to reveal." Elena touched the small black rose tattoo behind her left ear, her fingers tracing the delicate petals that carried so much more meaning than their appearance suggested. "Ava, I've been trying to avoid those decisions for 3 years." Torres smiled grimly. "Elena, I don't think avoidance is going to be an option much longer." The next day passed with the peculiar tension that precedes anticipated combat operations. Elena continued her medical duties, but her movements had acquired a different quality, more alert, more purposeful, suggesting someone preparing for possibilities that went beyond standard medical responsibilities. At 1400 hours, Elena was reviewing medical evacuation procedures when she discovered something in her personal gear that hadn't been there the previous day. A small, weathered photograph showing herself and several other people in specialized tactical equipment. Elena recognized the photograph immediately. It was an image from Operation Bloodline, taken approximately 4 years earlier during a mission in eastern Afghanistan. The people in the photograph wore equipment that clearly exceeded standard military issue, and their bearing suggested training and experience that went far beyond conventional operations. Elena turned the photograph over and found a handwritten note. "Some roses bloom in the darkest places. Some people are most dangerous when they appear most vulnerable. Tonight, remember who you really are, a friend. Elena understood that someone with knowledge of her real background had left the photograph as a message about the evening's anticipated events. The note suggested that tonight's defensive operations would require capabilities that exceeded standard combat medic qualifications. Elena placed the photograph in her personal gear and began mental preparation that she hadn't used for 3 years. The systematic review of skills, equipment, and procedures that had once been second nature during her service with Operation Bloodline. If Elena's true identity just dropped your jaw, subscribe immediately, because the biggest betrayal is still coming. Our channel exposes the hidden heroes the system tries to bury. Hit that bell to witness how friendship and duty collide in the most devastating way. As darkness fell over Forward Operating Base Helmand, Elena was completing her final equipment check when Torres appeared with information that would force her to confront everything she had tried to leave behind. "Elena," Torres said quietly, "I need to tell you something about tonight's operation." Elena continued organizing her medical supplies, but her attention was completely focused on Torres. "What about tonight's operation?" Torres sat down across from Elena, her expression showing the strain of carrying information she had hoped never to reveal. "Elena, the intelligence about tonight's attack didn't come from enemy communications intercepts." Elena's hands stilled on the trauma kit she'd been preparing. "Ava, what are you saying?" Torres took a deep breath before continuing. "Elena, the intelligence came from planned coordination with friendly forces. Tonight's attack has been orchestrated to create a situation that will require your real capabilities." Elena felt the careful structure of her understanding collapse around her, like a building losing its foundation. "Ava, are you telling me that tonight's attack is a test?" Torres nodded miserably. "Elena, there are people who need to verify that Raven 17's skills haven't deteriorated during her time away from special operations. There are missions coming that will require someone with your specific capabilities." Elena stood up slowly, her medical bag secured and properly positioned on her shoulder. "Ava, how many people are going to die tonight for this test?" Torres's expression showed pain that went beyond professional disappointment. "Elena, the attacking force consists of actors using non-lethal weapons, but the test is real. Your responses will be evaluated, and the results will determine whether you are recalled to active special operations status." Elena looked directly at Torres, and something in her blue eyes had changed. The calm acceptance had been replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "Ava, how long have you been part of this?" Torres met Elena's gaze despite the obvious difficulty of the confession. "Elena, I've been assigned to monitor your situation since you were placed at Helmand. My orders were to evaluate your psychological state and determine when you might be ready for reactivation." Elena absorbed this revelation with the same analytical precision she had brought to medical emergencies, but now her analysis was focused on questions of trust, betrayal, and the manipulation of personal relationships for operational purposes. "Ava, our friendship is real," Torres interrupted urgently. "Elena, everything between us has been genuine. The surveillance assignment came later, and I've been fighting against it because I knew you wanted to leave that life behind." Elena picked up her medical bag and walked toward the tent's exit. "Ava, if tonight is a test, then I hope you understand that the results might not be what anyone expects." Torres stood up quickly. "Elena, what do you mean?" Elena paused at the tent's entrance, turning back to look at Torres with an expression that revealed depths and currents that ran far beneath her surface calm. "Ava, Raven 17 was trained to accomplish missions regardless of obstacles, complications, or personal costs. If tonight requires those capabilities, then that's what tonight will receive." Elena left the medical tent and walked toward her assigned defensive position, understanding that the quiet anonymity she had maintained for 3 years was about to be replaced by capabilities that would change everything about her situation at Forward Operating Base Helmand. At 22:15 hours, the attack began. The first indication was the sound of incoming mortars, but Elena's trained ears immediately recognized that the explosions lacked the distinctive acoustic signature of high explosive rounds. The attacks were designed to create realistic combat conditions without causing actual structural damage or casualties. Elena moved toward the medical facility's designated defensive position, but her route took her through areas where she could observe the overall tactical situation. What she saw confirmed Torres's revelation. The attacking force was moving with precision that suggested professional training, but their equipment and procedures indicated simulation rather than actual combat. Elena understood that she was being evaluated, and that her responses during the next few hours would determine whether she could continue her quiet existence as a combat medic or would be recalled to the world of classified operations and extraordinary danger. Elena made her decision. Instead of remaining in the protected medical area as conventional defensive plans required, Elena began moving toward positions where she could more effectively influence the tactical situation. Her movements carried the confidence and precision that had once made Raven 17 one of Operation Bloodline's most effective operatives. Elena reached an elevated position that provided observation of the main approach routes, and from that vantage point, she began coordinating defensive actions with a level of tactical sophistication that exceeded anything a standard combat medic should possess. Using hand signals and position movements that would be invisible to anyone without specialized training, Elena began directing defensive fires and personnel positioning with surgical precision. Her actions were subtle enough to avoid drawing direct attention, but effective enough to significantly improve the base's defensive posture. Within 30 minutes, Elena had identified and neutralized what appeared to be 27 separate hostile positions. Using tactics that combined medical knowledge with combat capabilities in ways that standard military training couldn't produce. Kane, who had been assigned to a defensive position approximately 50 meters from Elena's location, watched her performance with expressions that revealed his growing understanding that everything he thought he knew about her had been completely wrong. Elena's rose tattoo caught the light from illumination flares as she moved through defensive positions, the delicate petals and thorns serving as a reminder that some people are most dangerous when they appear most vulnerable. Elena reviewed the certification program, Combat Medic to Registered Nurse Pathway, 18 months from battlefield trauma care to civilian emergency room leadership, 87% placement rate in top hospitals nationwide. This professional certification transforms military medical skills into high-paying healthcare careers, proving warrior training creates the finest civilian lifesavers. The simulated attack concluded at 23:45 hours, with Elena's tactical interventions having significantly shortened the duration and improved the defensive effectiveness beyond what conventional planning had anticipated. As personnel began securing equipment and returning to normal base operations, Reynolds appeared at Elena's position with an expression that showed satisfaction mixed with something that might have been relief. "Raven 17, Reynolds said quietly, outstanding performance. Your tactical skills appear to have suffered no degradation during your time away from special operations." Elena looked at Reynolds with those unsettling blue eyes, and he saw something there that made him understand that the evening's events had changed more than just Elena's official status. "Agent Reynolds," Elena said quietly, "I hope you understand that tonight's evaluation has consequences beyond simple skills assessment." Reynolds studied Elena's expression, recognizing that her cooperation with the evening's test didn't necessarily indicate willingness to accept whatever assignments might follow. "Raven, there are missions developing that require someone with your specific capabilities, missions that can't be accomplished by conventional personnel." Elena touched the small black rose tattoo behind her left ear, her fingers tracing the delicate petals that had witnessed capabilities she had hoped never to use again. "Agent Reynolds, Raven 17 accomplished her mission tonight, but Elena Lawson made some decisions about her future." Reynolds' expression showed concern mixed with curiosity. "What kind of decisions?" Elena shouldered her medical bag and began walking toward the medical facility. "The kind of decisions that honor both healing and fighting, Agent Reynolds. The kind that prove some people can be warriors in different ways. Feeling that sweet satisfaction of justice served? Subscribe for more military vindication stories that prove silent strength beats loud arrogance every time. We showcase real warrior redemption. The bell guarantees you'll never miss another underdog triumph that restores your faith in true heroes." The next morning brought resolution to conflicts that had been building since Elena's arrival at Forward Operating Base Helmand. Kane appeared at the medical tent at 0700 hours, his expression showing a transformation that reflected his understanding of everything that had occurred during the previous night's events. "Corporal Lawson," Kane said formally, "I owe you an apology." Elena continued organizing medical supplies, but her attention was focused on Kane's words. "Sergeant Kane, Apologies aren't necessary. Military personnel operate according to their understanding of tactical situations. Kane moved closer to Elena's workstation, his bearing showing respect rather than the aggressive hostility that had characterized their previous interactions. Corporal, my understanding of tactical situations was completely wrong. What I witnessed last night was the performance of someone whose capabilities exceed anything I've encountered in 6 deployments. Elena looked up from her equipment organization, meeting Kane's gaze directly. Sergeant, last night required responses appropriate to the tactical situation. Nothing more. Kane shook his head slowly. Corporal, what I saw last night was someone who combined medical expertise with tactical skills in ways that protected people and accomplished objectives that conventional approaches couldn't achieve. Elena understood that Kane's transformation reflected his recognition that her capabilities served purposes that aligned with his own professional values, despite their unconventional presentation. Sergeant Kane, Elena said quietly, medics don't fight. We protect those who do. Kane nodded with genuine respect. Corporal, I understand that now, and I understand that protection can take many different forms. Elena returned to her equipment organization, but something in her expression showed satisfaction, that her capabilities had been recognized without requiring her to abandon her chosen identity as a medical professional. Morrison appeared at the medical tent at 0900 hours, carrying orders that would determine Elena's immediate future. Corporal Lawson, Morrison said formally, I have orders from Battalion Command regarding your assignment status. Elena stopped her equipment organization and gave Morrison her complete attention. Yes, sir. Morrison opened an official folder and removed documents that bore classification markings Elena immediately recognized. Corporal, you've been offered reassignment to a Special Operations Medical Unit that would make full use of your advanced qualifications. Elena studied the orders carefully, noting that they provided opportunities to serve in roles that would align with her actual capabilities while maintaining her preferred focus on medical responsibilities. Sir, Elena said after reviewing the documents, what would be the alternative to accepting this reassignment? Morrison's expression showed understanding of the complexity of Elena's situation. Corporal, the alternative would be to remain in your current assignment as a combat medic, with the understanding that your background and capabilities are now part of your official record. Elena considered both options, understanding that either choice would end the anonymity she had sought, but would allow her to continue serving in medical roles that aligned with her personal values. Sir, Elena said finally, I would like to remain in my current assignment as a combat medic. Medical care at forward operating bases serves purposes that align with my professional goals. Morrison smiled, his expression showing respect for Elena's decision. Corporal, that choice has been anticipated and approved. Your service record will be updated to reflect your actual qualifications, but your assignment will remain unchanged. Elena understood that she could continue serving as a combat medic while acknowledging the full scope of her capabilities, a resolution that honored both her past service and her chosen future. Torres appeared at the medical tent during the afternoon, her expression showing relief mixed with concern about their friendship's future. Elena, Torres said quietly, I know you understand why I couldn't tell you about the surveillance assignment. Elena looked at Torres with those blue eyes that had seen too much betrayal and too much loyalty to make simple judgments about complex situations. Ava, I understand that military service sometimes requires difficult choices about personal relationships. Torres moved closer to Elena's workstation. Elena, our friendship has always been genuine, regardless of official assignments. That hasn't changed. Elena reached out and took Torres's hand, her gesture showing forgiveness mixed with the understanding that some experiences change relationships in ways that can't be reversed. Ava, Elena said quietly, friendships survive when people understand that service sometimes requires sacrifices that extend beyond personal preferences. Torres squeezed Elena's hand gratefully. Elena, what happens now? Elena looked around the medical tent that had become her home for the past several weeks, understanding that she could continue serving in an environment where her capabilities were acknowledged and respected. Now we continue serving where we're needed, Elena said simply. Medics don't fight, Ava. We heal. We predict. We save the people who do fight. Elena touched the small black rose tattoo behind her left ear, her fingers tracing the delicate petals that had survived everything from Operation Bloodline to Forward Operating Base Helmond. Some flowers bloom in the darkest places, Elena said quietly. Some people are most dangerous when they appear most vulnerable, but the most important battles are fought by people who choose healing over harm, even when harm would be easier. Torres smiled, understanding that Elena had found a way to honor both her past and her future without sacrificing the values that made her who she truly was. Elena returned to her medical equipment organization, her movements carrying the same methodical precision that had characterized her work since arriving at Helmand. But now that precision was acknowledged as the product of exceptional training and experience, rather than dismissed as obsessive attention to detail. The rose tattoo behind her left ear caught the afternoon light, filtering through the medical tent, its delicate petals and thorns serving as a permanent reminder that strength takes many forms, and that the most powerful warriors are often those who choose when not to fight. Elena Lawson, Corporal, United States Army Combat Medic, formerly Raven 17 of Operation Bloodline, continued her work saving lives in a place where every day brought new opportunities to prove that healing and fighting aren't opposites. They're different expressions of the same commitment to protecting the people who depend on you. The quiet strength that had always defined her remained unchanged. Only now, everyone finally understood what they were looking at when they saw the small blonde woman with the rose tattoo who moved through the medical tent with surgical precision and Arctic calm. Some people serve where their qualifications suggest they belong. Others serve where they're needed most. Elena had chosen to serve where she could save lives. One patient at a time, one crisis at a time, one day at a time. Medics don't fight. They protect those who do. 6 months later, Elena's transformation became legend throughout the forward operating bases of eastern Afghanistan. New personnel arriving at Helmand would inevitably hear whispered stories about the quiet blonde medic, whose rose tattoo marked her as someone far more dangerous than her gentle demeanor suggested. They learned quickly to watch how she moved through crisis situations, not with the frantic energy of someone overwhelmed, but with the surgical precision of someone who had faced far worse and emerged stronger. Kane, now serving as her unofficial protector rather than her tormentor, would tell recruits about the night he watched a combat medic coordinate tactical operations with capabilities that defied explanation. "Never judge people by their covers," he'd say, his voice carrying the respect of someone who had learned humility through revelation. The most dangerous person in the room is often the one nobody notices. Torres remained at Helmand, her surveillance assignment quietly terminated, in favor of genuine friendship with someone who had chosen service over recognition. Together, they established medical protocols that integrated Elena's advanced capabilities with conventional combat medicine, creating standards that would save countless lives across multiple deployments. Elena continued her work with the same methodical precision that had always defined her, but now her colleagues understood they were witnessing excellence rather than obsession. Her rose tattoo became a symbol throughout the medical corps, a reminder that strength takes many forms, and that the most powerful warriors are often those who choose healing over harm. The quiet revolution of understanding Elena had sparked rippled outward through military medicine, changing how people evaluated capability and redefining what it meant to serve with honor in the shadows.
Behind every uniform is a person trying their best, seeing each other with respect. Thank you for being here. Don't forget to subscribe to TNG Story.